welcome everybody to what is one of the first episodes of what we're calling Calandra Corner, a place where we discuss both informally and formally about various things that deal with Italian-American culture, but also the relationship between Italy and the United States, and especially between Italy and Italian America, as we might call it. Today, we're delighted to have with us four of the contributors, the co-editor of the book, and four of the contributors to a book dedicated on John Fante. And so we have with us the co-editor of the book, Giovanna De Lello, who is the director of the John Fante Festival, which takes place every year since 2006. In his parents' hometown. She is also the director of a video on Fante, and basically, along with Francesco Durante, perhaps the second person, the first person, however, depending on their activities, of bringing Fante to the public in Italy. And then we have Giancarlo De Cataldo, who is by training a judge and who is also a screenwriter and writer. And I remember a couple of decades ago when this book came out called Romanzo Criminale, which was a big success in Italy, and in a way brought forth also this whole idea of the mystery novel, of the detective novel, back onto the scene in Italy, and that was great. Our third contributor is Lia Giancristofaro, who is an associate professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Gabriele D'Annunzio in Chieti in Pescara, and she's also the director of Rivista Abruzzese, that she's the director actually for a while now. And then finally with us is Frank Spotnitz, who is a television screenwriter and producer, and has worked considerably with RAI, and he's also with us today. And then, of course, you all recognize, or viewers recognize, Fred Gardaphé, our distinguished professor of English and of Italian-American Studies at Queens College, and with us at the Calandra Institute. This is a wonderful experience for us because we're talking with some of the people who have done some really good work on just along the cultural scene in Italy, the academic scene in Italy, as well as John Fante. So just my own, I'll make one or two observations and then we can go from there. I'm always, in a very positive way, tickled by the fact that Fante has had such success in Italy. I remember in the mid-90s walking into a bookstore in Florence and seeing piles and piles and piles of books, of translations, like 4 or 5 novels, I think, had come out in that period of Fante, and they were all published by Marcos y Marcos, and they had these wonderful pastel colors. So when you walked into the bookstore and you saw all these piles, you couldn't miss them just because of the colors coming out at you. And then, of course, I saw Fante, and I just thought, wow, I guess it's there. Fante had sort of fallen into oblivion in the United States, and then was brought back to life as a writer when Charles Bukowski rediscovered him, and when in the 80s, Black Sparrow Press decided to republish all of Fante. And now instead, here we are, as I said, we're with one of the two main proponents of Fante, Giovanna De Lello. And Giovanna, I would ask you to begin our conversation.
Yes. Okay. Yes, you're right. John Fante is very popular in Italy. It's very popular also in Abruzzo, the region where comes from the family of John Fante, the father side. Why? Probably because you have to know that in Italy, Fante is very loved by young people, new generation. Probably because of the style of John Fante, the irony, but also I think because of the theme of immigration. In Italy, the theme of immigration is very, felt because we are a country of immigration. And I think also because it's literally of métissage, the mix of, two cultures together. And probably because Fante, it's a sort of, the themes of John Fante is like the main characters. I mean, Arturo Bandini, I think it speaks to young people because they speak about precariousness. You know what I mean? The characters are they are the anti-heroes, anti-heroes. So they live a strong sense of precariousness, and it's very now it's like it's today. It's a very modern. It's a feeling that we live here now in the world today. So probably because that. And at the festival, we have also authors all over the world, international, national authors, but also students, Italian students who want to write about John Fante. So this is very nice, I think, for us to have young people. And it's a very strange career now for John Fante. He was neglected in the past, and now he is now a beloved writer. I can say also, but about the festival, maybe I can say that about the festival. In Abruzzo, the festival, the John Fante Festival, it's very popular because John Fante is popular, as I say. But probably because John Fante is like in Abruzzo, it's like a cultural icon, something very from Abruzzo, Abruzzese. And probably with the festival, we contribute to make this. You know what I mean? This is a festival very popular in Italy. You know, the national press. We are in the national press, so we contribute to do something with not the Abruzzo. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of John Fante's fame, because let me just open up parentheses and then we can go back to our conversation. Fante has become so popular in Italy, so popular, that all of his works have been published in what is the Meridiani series by Mondadori, which is, we should say, for the people who don't know, it is the place par excellence where you want your books, your works to end up, right? Eugenio Montale, Ungaretti, all the writers, all the main writers of Italy have their major writers have their works published in the Meridiani series. And here is John Fante in the same series. Yeah. And I always find that to be on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, it's a little bit ironic because just of the fact that if we want to talk about Fante as an Italian-American writer, Italian-American studies in both in the United States and in Italy is not on everybody's radar screen. Yeah. And here instead is John Fante, who has made it to the Meridiani series. And I just wanted to point that out because it really speaks to what the sort of quote unquote dominant literary culture thinks of Fante, right? He made it in that.
Yeah, but you're right. But this is in 2000. It's thanks to Francesco Durante. The editor was Francesco Durante, so it was very important for John Fante, career in Italy. Mm-hmm. Francesco. This is why I said he's a master. He's, and he was also his translator.
Right, exactly.
Thanks to Francesco Durante.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I want to point out, and then maybe Giancarlo, as a writer, you can speak to this. The other thing I wanted to point out was that for those of us, I being one of them, who have studied 20th century Italian literature, and you study those quote unquote young writers of the 40s, such as Pavese, Vittorini, etc. When you get into some of their archives, some of their works, Vittorini speaks about this in Americana. you find a number of American writers mentioned, and there are two Italian-American writers. And one is Pietro di Donato, and the other is John Fante.
Oh yes. First of all, let me say I'm happy to be here, and I'm proud too. And I want to salute my old friend Frank Spotnitz as the first thing. We had a communication about the possibility of writing something together from the works of John Fante and regarding the life of John Fante. And maybe one day. This is, for a writer, this publication, this book, this kind of book is precious, is a kind of consecration. It's being known as a great. And I'm so sorry that all of this comes after he's dead, because if I have understood something of the character of John Fante reading his letters, they're very, very interesting letters that have been published in Italian, not the whole epistolary, but a part of it. And it was a mixture of irony and desperation and misery and love. And so it's a very complex character. And that's, according to me, one of the reasons of his success in among the young Italian readers and writers too. I want to tell you a thing. I was one of those who undervalued John Fante. And I was not a fan of John Fante's book. I remember in the 70s, it was there was some Italian translation. It was still alive, but it was not so popular. And I read about John Fante on the Gazzetta del Mezzogiorno, which is a newspaper from southern Italy, because Professor Vito Amoruso was a great Anglist, a great Americanist, studied and wrote about John Fante. But in that moment, there was an Italian mood, a very depressed Italian mood, and the great vitality of John Fante and the adventure of a fighter who in the end is a successful man, because John Fante's book are happy ending books. In John Fante's book, a migrant or a desperate can see the light in the end of the tunnel. And this is very, very American. This is not typical European. It's not typical Italian. That mood is really American. It's a Minguian mood. It's something. It's a Saroyan mood. It's not a case that Saroyan was a great friend of John Fante and the opposite. So in the 90s, but when in 2013, I was the anchorman of a TV show, a talent show about writing. It was a kind of X Factor show for young writers. A very, very crazy stuff, I confess. One of the great failures of my life, maybe the greatest failure in working in a TV show. And I was impressed by a lot of young people who wanted to be writers. And when we asked them, who are your masters? Where do you take your inspiration from? The whole of them, they answered by John Fante. And I understood they loved John Fante because in Dreams of Bunker Hill or in Ask the Dust, they found the struggle of a young man who wanted to become someone and to make something strong of his life. And it was a very positive feeling, a kind of very positive feeling. That's why I consider John Fante more an American writer than an Italian-American writer. But he always has to deal with his past. There's a continuous confrontation. I think that his past is, for John Fante, a mixture of hard rope and silken twine, something that you cannot cut off, but something that you want to refuse. In many of his books, I perceive a way to refuse the origins. I want to be American. That's, according to me, the message of John Fante. I want strongly to be American. I want to be part of this new culture. I want to be part of the American dream. I want to be someone who is ruthless and becomes something absolutely new. That's the real spirit of America that you find in Pavese, you find in Vittorini. They loved which writers did they love? They loved Steinbeck. They loved John Dos Passos. They loved this great dream of going to the future, forgetting the past, and becoming a kind of a very, very quick train who is running towards the future and a wonderful future. I don't know if this feeling is now the feeling of the third millennium, but it was in the past, and John Fante captured this.
Thank you. So let me ask Lia, you as a cultural anthropologist, someone who deals with the anthropology of literature. Where do you see Fante in all of this, especially with regard to the relationship Italy-United States?
This is very interesting. I care about this domain, anthropology of literature, beside all many other interesting. But Fante, I think, is particularly fruitful as attention, and I don't think he was never reading something as anthropological literature and science, but anyway, he is able to reach the anthropological point of view through the ironic attitude. That means a reflexive point of view that allows to him to be writing a culture. Is able to write his father culture. His father struggling with two cultures, two words, the old word of Torricella Peligna. I mean, it's a very conservative word. You can imagine in Torricella Peligna, all records of Nick Fante were about conservation of culture, hierarchies, powers, patriarchal power, well-being power, archbishop power, religious power. He says Mingo, Fante, lo zio Mingo, Uncle Mingo, that was a brigante. He was killed by the militaries of the neo-born Stato Italiano. He was a hero because he was fighting against the new. All was new. He was stabling a conservation of power and hierarchies. So this is very important. It's very important. John Fante underlines that. So in his literacy works embodies the anthropological perspective, and he does that in exploring the cultural conflict that is over than an intergenerational conflict, is an intercultural conflict. The references of his father culture are very reflective and very detached from the pain of the son. There is a deep pain of the son, but the way he wrote that is amazing, because I think he's detached like an anthropologist. And he talks about, he describes and documents all the typical classifications of the Mediterranean culture, the sacred and the profane, the behavior of man and the behavior of the woman, the status of the wealthy people and the status of the poor people, the status of hegemony and the status of the subordinate are described like a not changeable reality in the father of John Fante. And John is really also about dialect, but there is also this continuous talking about words, food, garlic and wine, and things that make the man, things that build the woman as a fable reality, subordinate reality. There is a long panorama, large scenarios of symbolic meanings in his literary works. But what I really think it's building an anthropological point of view is the ironic collocation of the writer. And I think this is really amazing.
Thank you. Let me ask Frank, you're from a different world here. Just about everybody here is a writer, right? You come from the world of visuality. And so how does Fante speak to you from that point of view when you think of, you've done wonderful shows, you've won Emmys and Golden Globes, et cetera. So now what does Fante mean in that sense?
I think I discovered John Fante at the perfect moment in my own life because I had just moved to Los Angeles to stop being a reporter, which was my first career, and to try to make it as a television writer. And I discovered the first book was Dreams from Bunker Hill. And then I devoured all of his books within a period of a few months. I couldn't get enough of him. And I think the first thing was just his language is so clean and pure and direct, and it reads like it was written yesterday. And that's his discipline as a writer. Obviously he loved Newt Hampson, he loved Sherwood Anderson, Ernest Hemingway, and you see that in his prose. But he's just so honest, and all the contradictions in his character everybody's been talking about. He feels the racism and the pain. I mean, it's hard for people today to understand how much racism there was against Italians, during his childhood especially, but even as he was a young man. And he feels that pain and that discrimination, and yet his reaction is to be fiercely proud of being Italian. And you see his bravado, Arturo Bandini's bravado. I'm going to be a great writer. I am a great writer, but you sense his terror and his fear and his insecurity. And he's so funny. He's so absolutely hilarious, and he's cruel. He can be incredibly cruel, but also you sense his tenderness and his kindness underneath it. And I fell in love with John Fante right away. And it's been kind of like a 32-year obsession for me. And I got to know, I was too late to meet John. He'd passed away by then, but I did get to know Joyce and knew her for many years, and Vicky and Jim Fante, and I've stayed in touch all this time. And I think he's just one of the great, writers of the last century. And I'm just delighted that new generations are still discovering him, and not surprised at all, because that honesty and it's so self-revealing of who John was, in his work, in a way that I don't think he was as a man, of knowing his family and people who knew him when he was living. As a man, I think he was much more difficult. And I think that's why actually he's been more successful in death than he was in life. I think actually the man got in the way of the career in many, many ways. But I am delighted that he's found the audience he deserves.
and he made his living as a screenwriter more than a novelist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious because, I mean, having worked in Hollywood and working in television, it's political. There are politics involved in getting people to give you millions of dollars to make things. And John Fante was the worst, the worst possible politician you can imagine. And, his best work are not screenplays. It was not his forte. It's his voice that you love so much in his books. The stories, yes, but it's his voice. It's his humanity that comes through in those pages, and that's very hard in screenwriting. It's a different medium, and that wasn't his strength. Except for, I think, to me, one of his best films, Full of Life, I actually really like, and The Reluctant Saint.
I agree with you. Yeah, Full of Life. Yeah, I agree with you. I also like some of the unexpected role playing that goes on there. For example, Judy Holliday, whom we know as the sort of bimbo, right? In a lot of Hollywood films, there she is quoting Nietzsche.
Yes, which it's based on Joyce, isn't it? And you can see that. Yeah.
Okay, so Fred. What do we? Here are four Italian friends who just adore Fante, and here we are in the United States trying to get Fante into courses.
Exactly. I'm teaching Fante this semester, and my students love it. I have a student doing a beautiful essay on Odyssey of a Wop because she'd never heard that, and the idea of somebody interrogating and interpreting that earlier generation. I think Lia hit it on the head. When I wrote about the idea of Italian-American criticism as ethnography, that we are not really critics, we are just writing about what we read. And that notion was fortunately accepted, but it was previously rejected by the people I worked with. But I think this idea of he matters today because the same situations, the same questions that he was raising are raised by youth today. He is a writer to youth. When I ran into Fante through Bukowski, I was reading poetry, and he mentioned this guy Fante. I said, oh, he has a vowel at the end of his name. Must be Italian. Let me find him. And when I found Fante, it was like I found the answers to the questions I never asked my family. And I began to explore him. And I have an uncle that lives in Los Angeles. I called him up. I'm going to come and stay with you because I want to visit this man. I want to meet this man, John Fante. And the day of my mother's birthday, I was going to give my first ever Italian talk at a university. I was sitting in the parking lot because I had arrived too early. I was way too nervous. I arrived too early. I was listening to NPR, and it said, we have some sad news today. John Fante died. He died on my mother's birthday, May 8th. And I was shattered. I cannot meet this man. I cannot meet this man. So I made it my goal to get to know this man through his writing. And then when I did get to meet Joyce, and when I did get to meet his children and Stephen Cooper, because I had asked Joyce if I could do his biography long before Cooper was there. And she said, well, we'll see what happens. And Stephen lived there. So he had what would you call the right of discovery, I guess, and he was able to go in. But she said, but there's other things you can do, Fred. You don't just have, we need more than a biography. And that's when I ran into people like Giovanna, who was running around with a little camera. Would you like to participate in a documentary on John Fante? I said, oh, I love John Fante.
Yes, I remember. We were in Rome. Do you remember, with Francesca Durante?
Of course I do. And then a few years later, she said, well, we're going to start this festival. I go, how could you have a festival about a writer? Only in Italy can you have festivals about writers. We don't have them here. And so I went to one of the earlier festivals, and it was the most fantastic experience I ever had. Not because we were keeping Fante alive, but because I was seeing the effect that Fante had on all these other people. And I realized I'm not alone. I'm not alone in the way that this man affected my life. And I think that this book that Giovanna has brought out really speaks to the beginning of putting that into kind of a material legacy. We all have our stories about Fante. I wish I would have met him. Frank wishes he would have met, but we got to meet, and we found out how horrible in many respects he was. I once asked Pietro Di Donato about Fante, and he said, "Oh, he was just an old son of a bitch." He said, "I can't." I said, "You should have gotten along really well with him." And I realized that exactly what Frank said. It's the humor. I mean, when Christ in Concrete with Pietro Di Donato, people say, "Well, how come they don't have a festival for Di Donato?" I said, "Because he was so tragic, and he did not see the humor in the tragedy, and Fante couldn't deal with the tragedy, so he made fun of it, and that was how he dealt with it." And I'm writing a book now about humor in Italian American culture, and I make this distinction between the two. And it isn't until Di Donato gets way later in life, and usually he does it exactly what Lia says, through by being ironic. Italian Americans have a hard time being who they are. And so sometimes what they present, they have to be ironic about in order to be real. And I think that's what Fante does. And I think, with the book that has come out, we have all these different windows. I mean, there's a lot more people in that book than that can be on this program today. And I really hope that people go out there and get this book and begin to see not just the many faces of Fante, but the many ways that Fante has entered into the language of all these different people.
Yeah, let me just comment briefly about the book. I was when I got the copy of the PDF copy of it, I was of course happy to see it. Yet another book this year. There are 3 books, I think, this year on Fante in 2020 so far. There are 2 in Italy, and there's 1 in the United States.
From
Asta Florinda Donato and Stephen Cooper. Right, and then there's a single-authored book, and I can't remember the title now, by a scholar in Italy. So anyway, when I was looking at the table of contents, and I saw, of course, these names of the writers, and I thought, well, I knew about Vicky, and I knew about Veronese. I knew that they were fans of Fante because many years ago, Alessio Romano's first book was being presented at what was then called the Libreria Edison. It doesn't exist anymore in Florence, in Piazza della Repubblica. And so the 2 people presenting the book were Marco Vicky and Sandro Veronese. And at a certain point, Sandro, whom I knew already, and he kept talking about the influence on Alessio Romano. And he kept talking about this writer, and he would refer to him as either an Abruzzese or Molisano or whatever. And he would occasionally look over at me and just sort of smile a little bit. And then finally he says the name John Fante. And of course, we got into a conversation about the whole Italy-America thing. And of course, Alessio had studied Fante as a student, as a college student. So, but I was also, I was wonderfully surprised to see Gianni Vattimo, Mr. Weak Thought, dealing with John Fante. And so I thought, okay, so if Fante has sort of infiltrated himself, into the world of Italian philosophy, then I guess he really is a good writer, we can say.
But for me, for the municipality of Torricella Peligna, it was necessary to publish this book because this book is published on occasion of the 15th edition of festival. And the book contained writing of 18 authors who have participated at the festival. So for us, it's like a legacy, right? Mm-hmm. It's something, a way to give to audience, to give to the world what we do at the festival. What we did at the festival, thanks to the authors, thanks to Giancarlo De Cataldo, Frank Spotnitz, Lia, and Fred, but because Fred is inside the book. So it was urgence, you know what I mean? This is why today, today in this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just great to have this very diverse perspective. And then, of course, the third part, where I mentioned about Vattimo, the third part is so-called homage. It's called Omaggi a Fante. So yeah. I'm happy to see Fante having so much success, because I think it speaks to so many of the other writers, and who American writers, if not Italian American writers, because I keep going back to Italian American writers because that's our job at the John D. Cataldo Italian American Institute and this Cataldo Corner, right, is to deal with the history and culture of Italians in the United States, first and foremost. So, but it's very invigorating intellectually, I think, to see this and to see this continuing in Italy, especially for those of us who do know, are familiar with the Italian culture. Someone like me, who is by trade a professor of Italian literature, not Italian American. I fell into Italian American literature through the back door, snuck in through sort of theoretical writings at the beginning, so I would have time to get familiar, become familiar with the canon. I had no idea who these writers were, and my first experience was actually through Helen Barolini, through her novel. I had read her novel back in the late 70s, early 80s. So it's wonderful to see this happening. And again, I go back to my reference to the Meriani series. That was, it was just an over-the-top experience to see that as someone who, number one, is Italian American, and number two, studies the field. Yeah.
But I have to say also that John Fante is a beloved writer also in France.
Yes.
In France, last year we showed at the festival the film, the last movie of Yvon Attal, who is an actor and director, French actor and director, and he transposed the novel Mon Chien Stupide, like Duck Stupid. So, and in France, John Fante is a very popular writer too.
It's a wonderful movie too.
Frank Spotnitz knows.
Yeah. He transposed it from Malibu to the southwest France. Yeah. And it's really good, really charming. I think John Fante would have been really pleased. I just wish we could get a bigger audience for John Fante in America. I'm thrilled with his success internationally, but I think, for many reasons of bad luck, including the fact that he was a West Coast writer, I think that worked against him. But all of us here are all fighting on the same side to get him the recognition he deserves.
Have you seen the movie Ask the Dust?
Yes.
What do you think about it? I'm curious.
Well, for me, it goes back to what I was saying. For me, it's his voice is so much a part of the story, more than the narrative, actually. And the movie lost his voice. And I love Robert Towne. I have huge respect for him. But for me, the movie didn't capture the novel.
I think that who made that movie was out of focus. Maybe the authors, they didn't understand. They didn't love John Fante. Maybe they didn't love. It's a different story. He
loves John Fante. He tried for so long to get that movie made, but it surprised me because I know how much he loves John Fante. Robert Towne knew John Fante.
He was wrong.
But he didn't get his voice, I don't think.
Okay, that's true.
And he changed the story, right? He changed the plot, the story.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't know. I don't know what compromises he had to make to get it made, because I know he was desperate to make it. So it's compromises. You mean compromises on the point of view of production, from the production house and things of that sort, and changing the story.
Well, once you put Salma Hayek in a film, you can't just give her the little bit that she has in the novel. You've got to expand that, and that took the love story, and Hollywood, embraces that love story,
but Frank knows any screenwriter changes his story. When you pass from a book to the screen, it's always a betrayal. It depends if it is a successful and mutual betrayal or it's a fake betrayal.
We could have a Zoom call just about the challenge of trying to adapt John Fante for the screen, because I think it's extraordinarily difficult. But that's why I was really pleased with My Dog Stupid. And if you haven't seen it, or if you can get a hold of it, it's really good.
I'm going to see. I'm really interested in those letters when John Fante writes about his trip to Italy. They're really wonderful because he meets all the literary and cultural and movie Italian society. And he's very interested by Pierpaolo Pasolini. He thinks it's the only interesting intellectual he meets is Pasolini. But he becomes friend to a screenwriter who is maybe the only right-wing screenwriter in that period in which cultural industry was absolutely dominated by the communists and socialists. And so he tells him, be careful because they are all fucking Reds, and be careful because that Pasolini, he doesn't like women, he loves men, it's very dangerous. Imagine the son of Nick Fante who thinks about this man in Italy in the 60s. And so he buys a gun. You know, he was sentenced in Italy with a penalty because he bought a gun. And because he was afraid of a communist attempt in the 60s in Italy. And it's, according to me, that might be a wonderful movie. It's so typical with a cultural crash. He was Italian, but I insist, when he comes to Italy, he's an American in Rome.
Sure.
But that idea of Italy being prey to the communists was fairly popular the thought process here in the United States, that in the 60s and 70s, that Italy
it is still, that we had an excellent visitor last days in Italy. We try to explain us that the communists are going to invade Italy, the Chinese this time.
Yeah. So what is the future of Fante? Let me ask you this, and Lia, you're the professor by trade here. So what is the future of Fante in the Italian Academy? Where do you see him entering into, course syllabi and things of that sort? Has he made it there yet?
I don't see an enormous attention, but this work we are doing right now can be helpful. I love what Fred said about the universal conflict that Fante can catch in his literary works and can translate into a building of bridges between cultures. And it was a work in progress, as Massimo said. John was in trouble coming back in Italy. So he was an incomplete anthropologist working with his fears, with his suspicions, with his building of bridges between himself and the different cultures. And I think this is an identification that everybody of us can make through the literary works of Fante. I think right now with words, with good things, deep things that we are listening right now all together, building all together, we can make an interesting and good work to build again a bridge between Fante and Italy.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that he could be that main beam, the main beam to build on which to build that bridge. Yeah. Fred, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was going to agree with Lia, but what Fante does, I think, especially in the United States, is very rebellious, and I have to say that I have to encourage my students to rebel these days. So they're not drawn naturally to Fante the way I was drawn, back in the 60s. But there is something inside of them. I think the American system has really done a great job of exploiting and compromising the revolutionary spirit that's inside every human being, especially when they're in their adolescence. And I think Fante could be a dangerous writer in the United States in many respects, which to me would be very exciting, because he encourages people to do that. He loves his family, but he doesn't put them in a sacred mausoleum and say, this is the memory, this is the way they were. He can't stand his grandmother. He can't stand his grandfather. His mother is a weakling, and yet at the same time, he loves her. But he can say that. I couldn't respond to my grandfather the way that Arturo Bandini responds to his grandfather or father. My grandfather was a little wop. If I would have said that, I would have gotten slapped. But he takes that up and he makes that possible. And I think that's the way that I teach him in my classes. And I think that's the way we need to get some national attention. We need Giovanna's twin to come in the United States to do a Fante festival in the United States.
Why not?
And get some national attention.
Yeah, why not?
that I think is what will happen.
Yeah, I want to point to one more aspect of Fante's writing career that I find to be extremely exciting, and that is I found Fante to be a really great short story writer, and that's a real hard task to write it, because you have to grab the reader's attention and you have to keep the reader's attention. And after 10, 15, 20 printed pages, you have to have a reader go away satisfied. And not many people can do that. And here I'm going to make a couple of Italian references for our friends in Italy. When I started to think about Fante as a short story writer, I thought of two Italians. Not that there's an influence here, I just thought of two Italians. And of course, we know the short story is an Italian tradition. It goes back to the 14th century, right, with Boccaccio. But I thought of Moravia, whom I always thought was a great short story writer, Alberto Moravia. And then a writer I've studied over and over, who is also not that well known as a short story writer, who is Aldo Palazzeschi. And these are two writers who, when you read their short stories, they grab your attention, at least they grab mine. And I felt that Fante did the same thing. And not just the Odyssey of a Wop, which of course is a masterpiece as a short story, but even the other stories in that collection. Yeah.
My Father's God. My Father's God.
Right.
It's the name of the festival. My Father's God. Mio padre. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So, well, listen, I want to thank you all for taking time. This is we're getting into your aperitivo time. It's still a little early, but we're getting into your aperitivo time. But no, seriously, I want to thank you all. I want to thank you, Giovanna, for putting the book together, for doing the festival, for working alongside.
Show the book.
Show the book. Who has the book? Giancarlo, you have the book.
Okay, this is the cover. It's a very nice photograph, very intense.
That's the Meridiani.
This is the Meridiani edition. It's really a dream for every writer.
And we should say that they almost look like Bibles.
Yeah, but it's really precious. It has a sign like for the Holy Mass.
Right.
Listen, people, short stories, a rape, a kidnapping in family.
And then the book we discussed to which you've all collaborated.
And this is...
Yes.
There it is.
Bravo,
what is it? Dalla parte di John Fante. Exactly. Good.
This
and it's
is,
published by Carocci.
An old Underwood typewriter. This is the publisher.
Brilliant.
The John Fante typewriter.
Wow.
And this is... I'm looking for Frank Spotnitz or someone else's essay. Okay, I don't find, of course. This is Francesco Durante's last right.
Good way to. It's a wonderful way to end. Yes, a tip of the hat to Francesco. Well, listen, again, thank you all. And at one point or another, we'll revisit Fante, and at one point or another, you'll all be here, I'm sure.
Yes, we will.
And we'll see you the next time we're in Rome. Those of you who are in Rome.
I hope to have you at the festival next year, right?
If we're up and running.
American Institute.
Yes.
Everybody, but without masks, I hope.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be at that point.
We'll have Fante masks.
Great. That's good.
Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. It was a
Ciao.
pleasure.